Hello again and welcome back to our course on Excel 2019 Advanced. In this section, we're going to continue looking at text functions, and I want to start by reviewing a couple of tasks we completed in the previous section. Now, we've started to split up the employee data that we had into 5 fields. The first field is here in column E, and the balance of the information about each employee is in column F. Now, in a moment, I'm going to split what's in column F a little bit further, but before we do, I'd like to review an aspect of what we've been doing so far. And in order to do that, I'm going to look at E2. Now, in E2, we have a formula left, B2, C2 minus 1. And B2 is the text string, and C2 is the value 14. Now, if I click on C2, I can see that it's actually itself a formula. Find, semicolon, in B2. Now, if I take that find and copy it to the clipboard, and now select E2, what I can do is replace C2 with the function that I've just copied to the clipboard. So what I've done there is to replace C2 with find, which eliminates any reference to column C from column E. Now, I realise I've only done it in the case of row 2, but I could, of course, fill down to cover the other rows. Also notice that in the formula equals left, I have 2 references to B2. Now, what is B2? Now, B2 is proper. What I could do, and let me copy proper to the clipboard. Now I'm going to go into E2, and wherever I have B2, I'm going to put proper. And copy down. Now, if I carry on doing this, and if I did the same to the formula in column F, I could eventually get to the point where I have no references to the columns B, C, or D. And I could in fact find that columns B, C, and D are totally unnecessary because what I've done there is to create formulas with nested functions, and each function within its arguments may have references to other functions and its arguments, and so on. So I could finish up in a situation where ultimately each of my 5 columns with individual fields is really just a formula which only refers to what's in column A. So I would find all the other columns that I've introduced for the purpose of developing this system step by step. I could finish up with a situation where I could just do the whole thing with those 5 formulae. Certainly when I'm showing people how to do this for the first time, I break it down into steps. But if you can understand the use of formulae and functions, and if long formulae don't cause you a problem, then clearly not having these intermediate columns can be an advantage. If you find all of this a little bit confusing at this stage, it's probably best to stick with the approach I'm using here of building the whole thing up column by column. So I put E2 back to the way it was, and what I'm going to do now is to develop column by column a breakdown into the 4 remaining fields for the contents of column F. Now, I don't really think there's a whole lot of point you watching me do this. In fact, what would be a good idea is that I'm going to save this version as text functions 1. And if you want to try doing the next bit yourself, this isn't one of the exercises, but you can try it this way anyway. We'll then pick up immediately after this with text functions 2, where you'll see the breakdown of what I've done. So what I've done here is to continue to break up the information about each of the employees, and I've put headers on the 5 columns that have the 5 pieces of information about each employee. So we have name, start date, salary, department, and position. So what I'm going to do now is hide the working columns and bring back column A and talk about some of the other issues with the work that we've done here. Now, if you consider our starting point, you might think we've made some pretty good progress here because we've split up the information into 5 columns, but there are still a few things that need our attention. And of course, the first thing to note is that in the case of start date and salary, Both of those are coming across as text, and you can normally tell that because they are left justified in the cell. So starting with start date, it's clear that Excel 2019 hasn't realized it's a date field we're dealing with and hasn't realized that these are numbers. Now there are various ways of dealing with this. One of them is equals left. And if I want to convert text to a number, I can use the value function. So equals, value, open parentheses, close parentheses, and enter to confirm. And it now becomes a number. I can then select my whole column and fill down with Control D. Now column I contains numbers, so all I need to do is format as a date. Now it looks as though the contents of the salary column are also text, so let's turn those into numbers. Now in order to format that as currency, and I'm going to use US dollars, I can pretty much do that the same way as I formatted the start date column by selecting the whole column and formatting the cells. However, there is an alternative option, and that's the dollar function, and it's definitely one worth looking at. So equals, dollar, open parentheses, and you can see dollar has two arguments, the value you want to turn into the dollar amount, and then the second argument is the number of decimal places. So I'm going to move across to the end because we have our number, that's the formula there, comma, and I'm going to say 0 decimal places and close my parentheses. Hit enter to confirm. Note that when I do that, I finish up with the dollar amount as a text value because it's still left aligned. So I'm going to undo that one and fill down the value function. Control D to fill down. And I'm going to format that column as currency with 0 decimal places. And there we go. Now something that you may have noticed is that the names of these employees in many places have additional trailing places after them. For example, if you look in cell A2, if you remember the position of the semicolon is position 14 in the string, which implies that there are 13 characters before it. But if you add up the characters, it only comes to 12. The 13th character is the space. And you can see that between the E in Jose and the semicolon, you can see that there is a space. Now, generally speaking, trailing leading spaces, double spaces, etc., in many cases, they can cause a problem, but there is an Excel function to cope with this, and it's called the trim function, and it trims leading and trailing spaces and also multiple spaces. So where there's supposed to be a space within a string, it reduces it to a single space. So equals, trim, and press enter. Now, of course, there won't be any visible effect on what you can see in column E, but those spaces will be removed once I fill this formula down. Finally, I'd like to look at one more text function in this section. If you look at the department column, department name includes marketing, MKTG, which is here in cell Q8. We've also got R&D, etc. So let's suppose that some of the data you are processing has abbreviations, but you'd like to make it into marketing, research and development. Now, one way you can do this is to use the substitute function. Now, I'm going to demonstrate the substitute function here. It's not necessarily a particularly good way of doing this for reasons that will become apparent in a moment. So in Q2 is the formula equals left, N2, comma, O2 minus 1. Let's introduce the substitute function. So equals substitute. Now notice what it says there in the screen tip. It replaces existing text with new text in a text string. So open parentheses. Our first argument is we need the text. So that is our function, our left function just there. So I'm going to click at the end, comma. We now need to say what is the old text. So we're going to replace or substitute marketing, MKTG. So we're going to put it in quote marks and we're going to say MKTG, close our quotes, comma, and now the new text that we want to substitute it with. So again, in quotes, we're going to replace it with marketing, close quotes, and close our parentheses, and press enter to confirm. Now again, in this particular case, it has no effect whatsoever on cell Q2 that we've applied this formula to. However, when we copy it down, if you keep your eye on cell Q8, you should see it change. So let's highlight, Control D to copy down, and there we go. It's been replaced or substituted with the word marketing. Now that's fine, but it only did one substitution of marketing. And if I wanted to do a substitution of R&D as well, I'd have to use the substitute function twice within each formula within column Q. And so that starts to get a little bit messy. And there is a much better way of doing that, which we're going to look at later on in this course. Now, the example I've just shown you, you probably wouldn't do it that way. Really, only if you have one instance of something. You'd more or less treat it as correcting an error. There are one or two other text functions that we're going to come across later in the course, and we'll cover those as well. I suggest you do go through the help on text functions, but that's it for this section. Please join me in the next one.